Nothing quenches radioactivity, not burning, nor throwing in the sea, nor burying in the ground. Only time. Before we can go far in the atomic age, we must find a way to rid ourselves of its deadly weight.
This clip from 1947 basically summarizes everything I used to know about nuclear waste. It's very dangerous, it's going to outlive me by a lot, and nobody knows what to do with it. In other words, it's a problem that we're doomed to pass on to future generations. But a lot has changed since 1947, and today I'm going to take us through the exact nature of the dangers involved with nuclear waste, and then compare it to the waste of our other sources of energy that we have.
Yeah, hair more. Yeah,
it feels like I'm. It feels like now like
well,
I'm off.
I'm using the whatever it is. Yes.
Okay, if it looks good, looks good. Okay, so it is the middle of the Canadian winter. I am in a warehouse that has no heating systems whatsoever, and I'm wearing a t-shirt. And the reason is because the spent nuclear fuel from the Darlington nuclear plant is giving off enough heat to keep me almost borderline sweating at this point. This fuel powered the city of Toronto, Canada's largest metropolis, for 20 years. And I don't know if you can tell by the tone of my voice, but I'm not even a little bit worried. Nuclear waste basically breaks into 3 levels: low, medium, and high. Low and medium are things like tools and filters and uniforms. They're kind of boringly non-threatening. So I'm going to focus today on the naughtiest, gnarliest, nastiest stuff, which is the used nuclear fuel itself. This is a replica uranium fuel pellet for a Canadian CANDU reactor. This is what becomes the used nuclear fuel. And these things are powerful. Just 2 of these things in a reactor could provide enough energy to meet the needs of a North American today for an entire year. And that's with our current reactors. There's actually enough energy potential in 2 of these things to power a North American's energy needs for at least 60 years, but I'm going to get to that later. Most of the action in this video is going to revolve around Canadian CANDU reactors, but the principles apply to nuclear waste throughout the world.
This tiny pellet will produce enormous quantities of heat.
Before these pellets go into the reactor, they are safe to handle with bare hands. Those white gloves the workers are wearing are actually to protect the fuel from humanity's filthy fingers, not the other way around. The fuel will then spend a few years inside the reactor getting bombarded by neutrons and heating water to make electricity, as well as making medical isotopes. And when the pellet, which will be in a fuel bundle, comes out of the reactor, it will have changed in a few important ways. First off, it will be 0.001% lighter than when it went in. That mass will have been converted into energy. Exactly the amount of energy that Einstein predicted in his E=mc² formula. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. The second way this pellet will have changed is that it will be so hot that it would melt right through my hand, and then through my wood floor, and then through my neighbor's wood floor. But let's say hypothetically my floor is made of strong enough material to stop it from falling through, and now it's lying next to me as I'm writhing in pain on the ground, looking at it through the new Jesus hole in my hand. Well, after just a few seconds next to the pellet, I would guarantee myself a pretty gruesome death because of all the gamma ray radiation that I would receive from it. And yet, after 70 years of operating around 500 power reactors in over 30 countries, we don't have a single recorded case of a human dying from exposure to civilian nuclear waste. What I've learned is that sometimes the most dangerous things are actually the safest, because we make dangerous things safe. It's hard to imagine a more perilous way to get from point A to point B than sitting upright eating pretzels at 900 kilometers an hour, 30,000 feet over the North Atlantic Ocean or a mountain range in a thin pressurized tube that has thousands of moving parts, all of whose failure could imperil everybody in the tube.
Everybody on every plane should just constantly be going, "Oh my God! Wow! Yeah!
But yet flight is statistically the safest form of transportation we have. 19 times safer per kilometer traveled than traveling by car. It's so safe that they don't even bother giving you a parachute, just a tiny little pillow to cushion your fall with. The only reason it's that safe now is because it's so well understood and monitored. A wealth of know-how that came at great human cost. I mean, we've lost tens of thousands of humans to aviation accidents, including my grandfather, but every year less and less. Last year, for example, we lost about 400 people, and that was out of over 4 billion passenger flights. Compare this with the 10,000 or so people who die every year falling off ladders.
Live in an apartment with vaulted ceilings. Uh-oh.
Okay, we're gonna make sure that Chris is okay.
The ladder is a relatively quite simple piece of technology, and yet last year we lost as many people to ladder accidents as we've lost in the history of aviation accidents. Again, because we make dangerous things safe. It's why most airplane passengers pay very little attention to the flight attendant's safety demonstration and spend most of their time researching the movie they're going to watch rather than researching the safety record of the airline or the experience level of the pilots.
Do you even know how to fly a plane, man?
And now the cart containing the shielded casks with their burden of radioactive waste can be brought out on the floor.
Compared with building and flying airplanes, the engineering involved in shielding nuclear waste is relatively small potatoes, which explains why nobody dies. Volume-wise, these casks are only about a quarter spent nuclear fuel. The majority of what you see here is reinforced concrete and steel, and those two ingredients are key here because they make the difference between danger and risk. Because what's inside these casks is still quite dangerous, but the presence of all that steel and concrete means that I can stand here with zero risk to my health. So how does the fuel get from the reactor to these casks? Well, the first step is that robotics take it to a deep pool to cool off. A little time out here to put some respect on water's name. Thank you, water. You are the magic ingredient in most of the amazing things that happen in this world. When Elon and Branson and them make it to Mars, they're really gonna miss you. In a nuclear plant, it's the water that spins the turbines, it's water that moderates the nuclear reaction, it's water that cools the fuel, and water that shields us from the radiation.
Where we're staying, there's not much for radiation at all.
The fuel will stay in those pools for 10 to 20 years, at least here in Canada. Then the used fuel gets put into these dry casks right here. And oh, as I put my hand on it, it feels a little warm. That's actually coming from the fuel inside. And if I didn't have a Geiger counter in my other hand, I would be a little concerned. But as I read this, I see I'm under 2 microsieverts an hour right now. And that's not just this cask. I am surrounded with hundreds of these dry casks. And still, I'm getting a lower radiation dose than the last flight I was on. And these numbers you're seeing in these single digits are measured in something called microsieverts. They're about 10 times above the regular background radiation that like I'm getting right now and you're probably getting watching this. They're still hundreds of times below the lower limit at which you might start to risk health effects. In the industry, these levels are known as SFA, or sweet fudge all. Each one of these dry casks holds enough fuel to have powered the greater area of Toronto. We're talking 6, 7, 8 million people for an entire month. That is to say, in this one shot of these things you see around me is about 2 years worth of powering everything that happens electricity-wise in the greater area of Toronto. So is that a lot of waste? Apparently it depends on the tone of voice you use when you're describing it, because both nuclear proponents and nuclear critics use the same analogies to describe how much waste there is. For example, here's John Oliver advocating against nuclear power.
Put all those spent fuel rods together and you get a pile as big as a football field and more than 20 feet tall.
Or you could put them in a pile as big as 2 football fields and 10 feet tall, or half a football field and 40 feet tall, or 20 football fields 1 foot tall. The point is, we have a lot of nuclear waste and it's very fun to play with.
And now here's Kyle Hill advocating for nuclear power.
All of the high-level waste ever created by every nuclear power plant in the world could be buried in just a football field-sized space. Yeah, nuclear power is just that efficient.
So is that a little bit of waste or a lot of waste? I think the only way to move forward on that is to compare it to the alternatives. And we'll start with baseload power, because every grid in the world depends on stable baseload power, of which right now there's only 3 technologies doing that: hydroelectric dams, fossil fuel power plants, and nuclear power plants. For hydro dams, the waste is the massive concrete dam itself, obstructing the planet's greatest rivers, both while it's operating and after its life has ended. And also the flooding of the reservoirs causes methyl mercury to accumulate in the ecosystem, which can be very harmful to animals, humans included. The other alternative, fossil fuel waste, is almost certainly the worst of all. It's shot up into the atmosphere, killing millions annually from respiratory illnesses, strokes, heart disease, and lung cancer, causing asthma, ocean acidification, global warming, and there's lots of it. Here's a visualization of what a day's worth of New York City's CO2 emissions would look like piled next to the Empire State Building. This visualization was done before New York prematurely closed the Indian Point nuclear plant and replaced it with natural gas. And that's for just one city for one day, and it's significantly more than our football field. Then you have the intermittent sources like wind and solar. The reason I'm putting these sources behind the fossil fuels is because up till now we don't know of any grids that run on wind and solar without fossil fuels to back them up for when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. Wind turbines last about 20 years on average, while solar panels average about 30, and there's no existing recycling solution for either of them. The current protocol is to dump them in landfills, which is just starting to begin.
The Casper Regional Landfill has received more than 1,100 turbine blades from across Wyoming.
Meanwhile, the first big round of solar panels has yet to arrive at the dumps, but when they do, they will leach heavy metals like lead and cadmium, which are toxic forever. Oh, there's my green light. The most effective anti-nuclear energy film of my lifetime is almost certainly Into Eternity by Michael Madsen. The film is haunting in a way that Scandinavian filmmakers specialize in haunting films with all that empty space and silence. It's filmed in and around the construction of Finland's Onkalo Deep Geological Repository, set to be humanity's first long-term storage facility for nuclear waste. Long-term here means forever.
We have borrowed something from you to protect you. You should stay away from this place, and then you will be safe.
As the name Into Eternity suggests, the drama in the film revolves around the time scale during which nuclear waste remains radioactive. And it's structured around a letter left for future generations that is read by the director himself.
I am now in this place where you should never come. We call it Onkalo. Onkalo means hiding place. Onkalo must last 100,000 years. Nothing built by man has lasted even a tenth of that time span.
Well, hello there. I know this may appear as if I'm mocking the film, but I assure you, I'm actually a great fan. I just wish the director hadn't omitted so much critical information. Excuse me. It turns out one match doesn't provide sufficient amount of time to explain anything in meaningful detail, such as the fact that radioactivity decays exponentially. This decline means that while the film speaks of 100,000 years, it's actually only the first 1,000 that is significant. This key fact of nature, that radioactivity decreases exponentially over time, was made in a different way by Decouple podcast host Dr. Chris Kiefer during testimony to Canadian Parliament.
And after about 1,000 years, the only way for nuclear waste to harm you is if you eat it, pulverize it, and eat it. And I'm saying this as a physician who's looked into this in some detail. I'm not trying to brush off concerns here.
At least one member of Canadian Parliament, though, was either unwilling or unable to understand what Chris was trying to get across.
In fact, you told us I could go home to my people and tell them they could eat uranium. I mean, God help us, you know, us people in Northern
You're misquoting me, Charlie. I did not say that.
So yes, for all intents and purposes, the waste is basically radioactive forever. But remember what we've talked about in previous episodes that basically everything is radioactive, including you and me. The question we should ask ourselves is not, is something radioactive, but how radioactive is it and what kind of radiation is it emitting? And after about 600 years, there's basically no more gamma radiation being emitted by nuclear waste. And that's the kind that can hurt you at a distance. So this is an actual fuel bundle for a CANDU reactor. The question I have that I put to a health physicist friend, Mohammed, was how long would I have to wait after this thing comes out of the reactor for the radioactivity had declined enough that I could safely cuddle with it and watch a 2-hour film? And he did the math, and it turns out it would take 400 years. And after 400 years, I could safely cuddle up with this thing and watch a film. So now that we have a better sense of the nature of the danger here, what is the plan that nuclear countries have for the long-term disposal of the waste? The one that most nuclear programs have had in place since at least the 1970s.
Basically, we're planning to bury it.
We'll bury it. Okay. Right here.
So how does that used fuel get from those dry casks beside the power plant to the big hole in the Earth's crust? When we last left it, it was trapped inside a cask made of 80 metric tons of steel and reinforced concrete. By the time it's ready to be sent into the deep repository, it will have been relaxing here in these casks for 50 to 100 years. So after 100 years in the dry cask, how dangerous is the fuel at that point? Well, let's go back to our tradition of measuring the danger of used fuel by watching movies with it. As we talked about before, when it immediately comes out of the reactor, just a couple seconds near it will guarantee you a fatal dose. But after 400 years, you can safely cuddle the fuel bundle and watch a 2-hour movie together with no risk of impact on your health, either short-term or long-term. So after 100 years, you definitely don't want to cuddle it just yet, or at least not for a whole movie. That would be moving a little too fast. But if you keep a distance of 10 feet from it, then you can safely watch 4 hours of cinema together. You might want to watch Dr. Strangelove twice, or you could watch Malcolm X one time, or you could watch Everything Everywhere All at Once, and 10 episodes of Decouple Studios, which would be a great evening. As long as you kept your distance of 10 feet, you would run zero risk of any short-term or long-term health impacts. But to be as safe as possible, when it's time to move the waste to the deep repository, robotics will again be used to move it to a box made of 31 metric tons of stainless steel, which will then be loaded onto a truck headed for deep storage. Calling this thing a box feels a little imprecise, a little like calling a liger a cat.
Oh, he peed on you! Oh no!
These boxes have been put through every kind of test you could imagine. Dropped from heights, submerged in water, engulfed in fire, hit with a locomotive traveling at 160 kilometers an hour, and my personal favorite, parked directly next to a railway tanker car filled with propane, which is then detonated. So far, none of this creative destruction that these sadistic engineers cooked up has managed to break or even cause a leak in the Liger box. So we're going to assume that the box makes it safely to the deep geological repository, the big hole. So where to put this repository? Well, the research to look into that began a long time ago. Here's the head of the Canadian program in 1979 talking about the key quality one should look for in a good waste hole.
The only feasible way for this waste to get out is that water get at it at some point and dissolve it and then carry it back out. So by going deep in the rock, we get to a point where the amount of water will be extremely small if there's any water at all.
Fast forward 40 years and the lucky rock formation has been identified. But that's not it. Now you get to add in the engineered barriers. Because the used fuel won't just be tossed down there. It's going to be put inside a steel container, sealed with an outer layer of non-corrosive copper, placed inside a box made of bentonite clay, which is one of the hardest substances on Earth for water to pass through. And any leftover space in the cavern is going to be filled with additional bentonite clay.
Clay is something that has a very hard time for water to move through. We use it to line conventional garbage dumps and things like that because it's impermeable to water. Anyway, bentonite clay is like clay on steroids for that, right? And then we have, a robust copper-lined steel canister that's, you know, a couple inches thick and has copper on it because it avoids corrosion. Corrosion really needs oxygen to drive it, and there's no oxygen down there. But anyway, all that aside, water needs to get through all of there, do a U-turn and get back out, and then get up to the surface. It betrays the sort of, what we, I guess for lack of a better word, are starting to call safetyism. They're taking things to such an excessive level that my fear is it's maybe too expensive to do. You don't get the social license to do it. It doesn't happen. And it's scaring people. And it's scaring the shit out of people. You know, when you say, okay, we've got this copper, it's not going to corrode for 1 million years. Well, do you need it to hold what's there for 1 million years? Holy shit, if you do, like, that sounds scary as fuck. I mean, I've got dangerous household chemicals under my sink I'm not that worried about. Like, yeah, that scares the shit out of people, for sure.
I can honestly say that after researching this stuff for months and visiting all of these places in person, that if you're somebody who's worried about toxic waste's impact on future generations, then the nuclear industry probably shouldn't be the focus of your attention. Industrial civilization has littered this planet with all kinds of toxic substances. Almost all of them are dangerous forever, like arsenic and mercury, which don't have a half-life and don't decay and become less dangerous over time. I suggest watching Clark Ferguson's film Shadow of a Giant on the town of Yellowknife, population 25,000. There's a shuttered mine there right next to the city that has enough arsenic in it to kill every human on Earth, and it's leaking.
If we were to ever have a really big spring freshet, Baker Creek would overtop and flood out the mine within 3 days.
They packed up, took the gold, we got the shaft, we got shafted.
So earlier I mentioned that there's an alternative approach to managing nuclear waste long term other than burying it. And this approach is controversial. It actually challenges the definition of the used fuel itself. The definition of the word waste is material that is not wanted, the unusable remains of something. But our current nuclear reactors only use 1 to 2% of the energy potential of the uranium fuel.
What do we do to ensure a steady flow of nuclear fuel from now till forever?
This is Edward Teller standing in front of some used nuclear fuel. Teller is a complicated genius if there ever was one. He's the lead architect of the hydrogen bomb, the betrayer of Robert Oppenheimer, but also the only person that I'm aware of, and definitely the first person ever to walk into an American Petroleum Institute conference and tell everybody to immediately transition off of fossil fuels to avoid melting the ice caps and drowning New York. He did that in 1959, almost 50 years before An Inconvenient Truth.
And what you see before you here is equivalent in energy to the whole core reserves of the United States.
Teller here is talking about a breeder reactor, a technology that's been around since the beginning of nuclear power.
Here it is. What is it? You can't see it at once. It's something complicated.
Breeders aren't as popular as our current reactors for 2 reasons. One is that they're more expensive, and 2 is that they produce more plutonium, which is a key step to making a bomb, but by no means the only step, and probably not the most difficult. Should breeder reactors become the norm, then we would theoretically have enough energy to power the world for hundreds of millions of years. Perhaps even up until the sun explodes and engulfs the planet. I mean, what's the meaning of life if it's not to set up the conditions for your descendants to live long enough so that they can be cooked by a red giant star? To be honest, the more I think about this nuclear waste stuff, the less I see it as a problem, and the more I see that used fuel as the potential solution to future energy problems.
Without fuel, they were nothing. Their world crumbled.
Imagine future generations with no fossil fuels at their disposal, either because we've burned them all or because we've made the wise decision to leave them in the ground. And now they're struggling to meet their energy needs to power the basics of civilization, hospitals, transportation, water treatment. And then they learn that we had millions of years worth of uranium fuel sitting next to the transmission lines, and we buried it all deep in the Earth's crust, backfilled it, and then hid the location from them, which, by the way, is really one of the options that's being considered for what to do once they fill the deep geological repository.
I don't see the situation severe
if the site would be forgotten over time.
To be clear here, I'm not saying this is for sure what's going to happen. I mean, who can tell the future? I'm just saying that if I have to bet right now on which apocalyptic or catastrophic scenario is more likely to happen, I'm taking the humanity runs out of fuel and things get nasty and violent over the nuclear waste comes back to haunt us. Now, if after everything we've been through today together, you still are really worried about the waste and want to bury it, that's cool. I just don't want to hear anymore that there's no plan for the waste. Like, if you're concerned about it, they've got the best plan I've ever seen for anything. They've gone through every possible scenario. And I get that those of us who our instincts were trained on television and film see something that's called foolproof and immediately go, oh, that's the first thing that's gonna fail. But it's not like that. We can go back to the airplane example. Preparation is still the best way to make things safe. All I'm asking though is that if we do decide to bury it, that we don't do so from a place of panic induced by misplaced fears. Which brings me to this man sitting quietly in a boardroom in the Netherlands. Ewout is the deputy director of Cobra, the only nuclear waste storage facility in the world that allows the public to come and visit it. The building that holds their low to medium level waste doubles as an art gallery.
We, alongside the radioactive waste, store the collections of museums, because they can only put on exhibit 5% of what they have. Often those are artifacts that date back 400 years. People see that we have a long tradition of storing things that are much more difficult to store than these concrete waste packages that we have in storage.
Each tour has dosimeters with them, like this one, so that everybody can see the radiation dose that they're getting at all times, which gets most interesting when they arrive at the bright orange building, the one with the high-level waste, or the used fuel.
The waste inside the building is slowly transitioning, slowly decaying, and the building shows that process on the outside by the fact that we repaint the building every 20 years in a lighter shade of orange. And then your tour guide can bring you into the building where you're allowed to stand on the high-level waste itself. I think by opening up you show that you have nothing to hide and that managing radioactive waste is something we can do. But in practice it's very simple.
Or in the words of Paris Ortiz Wines,
Hey Paris, what about the waste?
What about it?